really, ultimately, standards are recipe books for complex technical tasks, and often tasks that occur between, between parties. And so the reason why standards have value is that what you don't want to do is one-off integrations. So you can imagine you want to integrate with an app. You write a snowflake piece of code, and then you get to the next one, you have to write another piece of code, and you get to the next one. And what happens is your resources just get siphoned into nothing. Whereas if you can write one time and enable every single partner you have to connect with you in whatever way you need to connect, then all of a sudden your investment creates a very, very scalable pattern.
Hello, everyone. My name is Joseph Carson. I'm the Chief Security Scientist at Linea, and I'm really excited. Welcome back to another episode of the 401 Access Denied podcast. And today I'm really excited to have Pamela with me today, who is going to be talking about identity. So Pamela, welcome to the show. Tell me a little bit about yourself, what you do, and some of the fun things you get excited about.
Excellent. Well, hi, everybody. Yes, my name is Pamela Dingle, and I am the Director of Identity Standards at Microsoft. And what that means is I work with an incredible team that gets to negotiate all of the ways in which the industry connects identity systems together. We'll put it that way. Okay. So those are identity standards, and it's a fun and challenging job that lets us talk both internally with all of our engineers and externally to all these brilliant people in other companies around the globe.
Fantastic. And so how did you get into identity? What was your journey? What was the background?
Oh, yes.
Is it something that you wanted to start your career off, or is it something that you kind of like segued into?
This is my origin story. I didn't know anything about identity, and I started off in system administration. So I was running Spark workstations for geophysicists in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. So hello to all Canadians. But I actually started in identity because I went to a conference. Not dissimilarly to where we are now. I went to a conference that was then called the Burton Group Catalyst Conference.
Okay.
Now, this was, I think, 2001. And so I got there and my eyes were the size of dinner plates. And I was just blown away by all the amazing things happening. But it was an identity conference. And what I realized was, there were really important things getting discussed, and I got really excited about it. And the reason I am where I am now in some ways is because, I got excited about it and I started asking questions.
Okay.
And so I was that person who put their hand up at the end of the talk and asked the question at the end of the talk, and did it consistently. And what happened was people started to notice that I was, both asking questions and asking reasonable questions. And I ended up building an interesting network of people just from those conferences and getting very, very excited about it.
And in 2000, that was pretty much, I think it was almost the start of the Jericho Forum at the time as well. So that's an interesting time to be getting into identity, especially when it was really a fundamental foundation that was being established at that point.
It really was. And in fact, the thing that really made an impression on me at the time was that Microsoft had announced a thing that was internally called Project Hailstorm, also known as Microsoft Passport. And I did not work for Microsoft at the time. I worked for someone else. So it's kind of ironic that I do work for Microsoft now. Okay. But at the time, I was just, a fly on the wall watching as the industry really reacted poorly to the introduction of that technology.
But it was kind of really, it was finding itself. It was kind of, you can't all of a sudden, when you're starting a new path, because I think in the early 2000s, that's really where identity started kind of finding its footprint and finding its, how it can change industry and how it can change even government's interaction with citizens. I think, of course, you had to start somewhere. It may have not been the greatest start, and also adoption. It's not dissimilar. I'm based in Estonia, and of course, Finland were the first to try and do an identity program back even 1999 or 98.
Right.
And Estonia thought, well, we'll try it, but we'll try it in a little bit different way. Finland wasn't so successful with their implementation, but Estonia was. So you do have to do the trial and error. You do have to find what works, and sometimes you have to experiment. So, but who were some of your idols along the way? Who was the people that you looked up to that were kind of some of these finding in the industry?
Oh yeah, there were so many amazing folks. So Kim Cameron.
Yeah, Kim Cameron, of course, absolutely.
If anyone wants to learn about the works of Kim Cameron, he wrote the 7 Laws of Identity, which really was a game changer. And part of it came from Microsoft pivoting based on reaction, to their original announcement. And so the 7 Laws of Identity are, epic. Bob Blakely, a lot of the Catalyst analysts, the Burton Group analysts at the time, Ian Glazer. Let's see.
Ian's amazing.
Yeah, Jamie Lewis, who ran the Burton Group at the time. I mean, all of these were epic thought leaders and just very calmly helping people understand that the best practices mattered and that the rigor mattered, right?
Absolutely.
And you're right. We, before 2001, really, when you think about what was happening before 2001, identity was essentially directories.
Yeah.
Right? It was, and
it's a phone book.
yeah, and directories were a huge improvement over databases because they had this hierarchical model and they were person-centric.
Yes.
And they also focused on authentication. And then, an LDAP bind was a huge revelation at that time. And then 2001 was really the time where people were starting to realize that their perimeters weren't enough and that they wanted to do business outside of their perimeters and they needed to be able to introduce people across boundaries. And that's the world that, the passport catalyst went into and certainly the Jericho Forum stuff was a big thing there, but also the Liberty Alliance was formed. And I'm told I wasn't there, so this is secondhand knowledge, so please nobody get mad at me if I've got it wrong. But, my understanding in a lot of ways is that Liberty Alliance was all about saying, well, what do we want? We want a world of identity where domains can have control, right? Where we can control identity, where we can have sharing of identity, but with rules that both sides can participate in. Right. And that's where we got the SAML 1.0 standard that turned into the SAML 2.0 standard. And that standard is still used today.
Yeah. So I do think, 2001 was a pivotal time. Because even that was probably what I remember. I went to Estonia in 2003. And when I went to Estonia, they had just started their identity journey as well from a digital society. So for me, I think that was a kind of really foundation of really kind of realizing that we need a way to do identity verification, digital signature. We need to be able to authenticate, provide authorization, and really get to make sure that everything is somewhat having a root of trust at a source and verification and transparency, and also non-repudiation. So, what kind of along the way, what things do you think have been important? Kind of, let's say, moments in the time where identity has really evolved.
Well, I will say that my experience is primarily in enterprise identity, which is, I think, different than even what
Estonia,
you've done in governmental identity or government to citizen, they might call it. But certainly in enterprise identity, there was this definite progression that occurred, right? So directories solved the problem of password proliferation, right? It didn't solve the problem of how many times you had to type a password.
Right.
It solved the problem of which password you typed. And so you would type the same password, but now you would type it at every application, everywhere you went, because password forms had not gone away. Only the backend database that you checked had now centralized, right? So that was step one. The next step was something called WAM, or Web Access Management. And what Web Access Management did was solve the how many times you type your password problem. And they did that by having a session cookie, essentially, right? And by placing usually agents at every application that could check that session cookie. So that you could log in once to a home realm, and then you could travel to all these applications, and the applications would know who you are because of this this token, session token. And of course, eventually it became an encrypted session token, which is very good.
Which is it's a good move.
Yes, turns out it was necessary. And then so that was the Web Access Management, and there was a point in time, I want to say around 2006, where it was smooth sailing. Everyone was happy, except the problem was, of course, that cookies, right? That cookies have domains, right, associated to them. And so you then ran into, it would have been before 2006. So then, everything that had been cooking in the Liberty Alliance and in Oasis, which is the standards body where SAML was created, sort of came to the fore right around 2006, where now this concept of federation came out, right? And because WAMs couldn't get you across those domain boundaries, the federation had its chance, right? And so all of a sudden you would end up in enterprise having a web access management system for your,
For your domain and
your
stuff.
soft chewy center with your hard perimeter. And then you would run your federation server only to make hops across into other domains. And a lot of what at the time people were doing was it was a lot about contractors and a lot about
third-party suppliers, temporary employees.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So that was sort of the age of federation, and which has continued.
And even it was the time, like BYOD was also kind of where people were bringing their own devices in and still wanted to have access to corporate services. And that was, it was almost considered like a contractor device in the scenario, but it was still an employee who was using their own personal equipment.
Yep. And that was also sort of the Web 2.0, right? When Web 2.0 came out. And so that's why single sign-on worked so well was, the SAML profile was all about web redirects. And that worked great until it didn't. And, the point where it didn't was really at the point where cloud platforms and native applications accessing APIs came out.
Yes.
Right. And those are the glory days of Twitter, really, where
you wanted application integrations. So, rather than having to, import and export data, you wanted to have that natural data exchange.
That's right. Exactly. And at the time, I don't know if you remember this, but what happened was the way that people would originally try to call APIs was to take your username and your password, base64 encode it, and then include it on every single API fetch that you made. And this still happens today.
It still happens today. It's actually, if you go to bug bounties, it's still quite a common problem that we actually find all the time.
That's really distressing, but I'm not surprised. But at the time, what was happening was that, Twitter was, quite revolutionary in its time. And it also had this third-party model, right? App model, where you could have a proliferation of apps in the smartphone app stores. And smartphones were pretty new at that time. And what was happening was those apps would just ask people for their usernames and passwords because that was the only way that they were able to access the APIs. And so there was something called the password anti-pattern that developed, which was basically users were being trained to enter a username and password for a service for anything that asks for it, right? There was,
and it became the password reuse, which,
that's right.
Which again, then you end up with one compromise, means that all the other accounts that you had to go through this password rotation and reset.
Right, right, exactly. And so there was a very strong pressure to find a solution for that. And that's really where OAuth was born.
Yes.
Was, not in the enterprise world at that time. It was really in this new emerging consumer cloud platform market. And so OAuth 1.2 and then OAuth 1.0 and then 1.0a, because they found a flaw, came out, but was really for consumer use. And then the pressure came from enterprise to do the same thing because now the enterprises wanted to have their own platforms.
Absolutely. And it's the same time that we were actually doing a lot of cloud migration as well and using SaaS applications. And it became important to make sure that you didn't have people having to have like multiple accounts everywhere.
Right. That's exactly it. Exactly. And cloud, it was cloud. You didn't have to say what cloud was. You just had to say cloud. Right. And, this is my test, by the way. My test for how real something is if somebody says a buzzword and you say, what about that buzzword is important, and they can't answer you, then it's not mature yet.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, I always laugh because that assumption that cloud is like something magical.
Right.
We just have to realize it's another computer in another place that you might not have access to or not have ownership or visibility over.
Right. I mean, I think that the buzzword of the day at this point, at least in my world, is ZKP or zero knowledge proofs.
Okay.
They're real. Like, don't get me wrong, they're real. It's just that most people want them without knowing what they, exactly why they want them. They just know it's good, but they don't know why it's good.
So let's fast forward to today. There's a lot of things happening around identity today, and I really like it because even though here at an RSA security conference, I was just saying I really enjoy going to identity conferences because it's less scary. Because here you get the fear and the scary part, but when you go to identity, it's more about enabling and integration and making it easy to get services,
right,
and making the experience much better. So I always enjoy sometimes jumping out of the security and going in the identity as that side. But what's really happening, what's exciting today? I mean, we've heard a lot about, I from my view, I've had a lot of discussion around things like passwordless. And I think sometimes the context gets lost in passwordless because it's more about a passwordless experience.
Yes.
There's still a secret somewhere that's being exchanged.
Yes.
So I would say, I think I've got to using passwordless experience as the proper term because for the user, that's experience. It's moving it more into the background when the exchange happens. So what other things, passwordless, what other things are exciting that you're, seeing in the industry that's really evolving today?
Yeah, I mean, I think the focus on secrets
Yep.
is the great thing about it is it's moving beyond just users. And so, so in the enterprise world, again, this concept of secrets management,
Yes.
it's very funny because we've always had secrets. We've always had many secrets. But what we've never had is a rigorous process applied to how they get managed. There's never been expectations necessarily.
Provisioned, migrated.
Right.
So
the whole idea of the life cycle and of that life cycle being tracked centrally, right? And of risk detection occurring upon all of these things, like all of that, that's a sort of a new pioneering land, right? And that's so much a case of identity and security colliding.
Yep.
I mean, that is just so much of what's happening right now is identity and security colliding.
That's the convergence. And it's also, you still have to think, what we don't want to get into is bringing it all in together and merging it too much because you end up just having a complex, big problem. I like to, because I learned years ago, it was one of the things that in Estonia, I learned that they had the mentality of having, not, at the time, it was we were talking about software-defined networks. And they're like, no. It's about service-defined networks. It's all about services. And that would made the realizing that you had to go through and have microservices along the way and make sure you have that segregation of duties. So when you get into, for example, single sign-on, and then separating, making sure you have the continuous verification, whether it being multi-factor or two-factor, whatever type of additional controls for security. Then you've got the authentication side. Then you have the authorization side. So it's always important for me is to make sure that you at least have some control and, let's say, independence across all of those. Is that something kind of you're seeing, the convergence happening across both the security and identity that's bringing those more together?
It is. I mean, the other one, could you talk about buzzwords, right? The other big interesting one right now is multi-cloud.
Okay, yes.
Where, you're not only now managing resources in one cloud, you're managing resources in two clouds. And frankly, you were probably already managing on-premises resources also, right? So all of a sudden you have this set of, maybe as many as 4, maybe even more environments, and you're trying to manage resources across them. And so at this point, permissions management becomes important. And, we've had lots of role management stuff occur before, but now it's really moved much more into the infrastructure as a service side of the house, right? So you as an identity professional are now starting to look at all those resource types and trying to apply policy consistently across all of them. So it's a big job, but the industry is pivoting to help make it possible. The other one that's definitely less in the security world, I mean, because I know you probably talk about, for example, passwordless all the time. The other big one is on the governance side. And so there's a lot of stuff going on right now. It's one of the favorite analyst cautions right now is around orchestration.
Yes.
So how do you take your workflows and make them intuitive, not only for the people who are running them or who are using them, but for the administrators that are trying to implement them.
Okay.
Right, which has a security angle, because if you can't understand how your workflows work, that's when there are cracks that can happen. Right. So understanding sort of what is your life cycle of getting a user into an org? What is your life cycle of having that user escalate privilege? Right. All of those things are getting much more baked and much more, there's a lot of time and energy going into making them easy, but also making them auditable. Okay. Right. And running risk detection, all of that.
And especially across that multiple clouds as well, because that's where the challenge, if you're not having some type of auditability across them, you end up having to keep going into each system individually and try to find what's happening.
Right. And the attackers just find the dark spots.
Yeah. The ones that you were not looking,
that's right.
The ones that you miss are, especially a lot of organizations who are doing digital transformation or moving to the cloud, they try to retrofit what they have on premise and push it to the cloud and end up realizing that they have some security by default or not enabled by default, misconfigurations, which ends up exposing them significantly. So you're working in standards. How important is standards today? And how long is the process to get a standard? Because I've seen a lot of I think years ago we've been talking about some of the standards, and I think today we're still talking about some of the standards as well. So what's the process and what's involved, and why is standards important?
So I think standards are more important than they have ever been because we are more connected to our world, from a computer to computer perspective than we ever have been. When I talk about standards, I'm really talking about interfaces that anyone can use that operate in a predictable fashion. So you can imagine, if you want to decide you want to go make blueberry muffins, you probably don't try to create your first blueberry muffin from scratch, right? Well, and you might, right? You might, through trial and error and great time, you might come up with your own recipe. But many, many people just go to a recipe book, right? And really, ultimately, standards are recipe books for complex technical tasks, and often tasks that occur between parties. And so the reason why standards have value is that what you don't want to do is one-off integrations. So you can imagine you want to integrate with an app. You write a snowflake piece of code, and then you get to the next one, you have to write another piece of code, and you get to the next one. And what happens is your resources just get siphoned into nothing. Whereas if you can write one time and enable every single partner you have to connect with you in whatever way you need to connect, then all of a sudden your investment creates a very, very scalable pattern. Yep. And so that's really what we do is we create the patterns for things that are very common. The amazing thing about identity is everyone has to manage identities. Yes. And so it's easy for us to recognize that the things that are in common between all of our different organizations. And so examples of standards, we were talking before about single sign-on. That's a perfect example. Yep. People need to get introduced across domains, right? Whether you're going to a SaaS app or to another cloud platform. And so that's, SAML is a secure introduction. That's really what it is. If you look at something like SCIM, which is System for Cross-Domain Identity Management, it's about the fact that everyone needs to call user APIs, right? Like, get me the user's name, get me the user's username and login, get me attributes about the user.
The objects and resources that they have,
Right. And you need to be able to push users into systems. You need to pull users out of systems and synchronize the data between systems so that you don't have data diverging, because a lot of that data becomes part of a security decision. And so that's another example of a pattern. SCIM is just a standardized user.
It helps to do deduplication as well, from actually having to have records in multiple places.
It does. Yeah, exactly. It creates a relationship between the two companies so that you get a ripple effect in case a user is removed, for example, or data changes. So and it of course increases accuracy. So in the old days, especially if you're a female, you got married and you changed your name in one system and it stayed changed in
the system. Yeah, even I've seen people moving between states or changing addresses and having car registration. All of a sudden, trying to maintain all of that just becomes a kind of administrative nightmare.
Right.
And actually one of the things that's what I loved about Estonian model was always that that data lake model where you've got data repositories in different areas, and what you do is you provide read access between each of them. So therefore, you don't duplicate the data. If it's in one location already, you tell it the metadata location of how to find it. And therefore, you can get accuracy. You have one place to keep it updated and maintained. And therefore, it just meant maintenance of it becomes so much easier.
Right. Makes sense. And then I think the other really big trend is decentralization in identity. And, there's obviously a consumer angle to that, and a government angle, and an enterprise angle. But generally speaking, the whole idea behind it is, identity these days is mostly accomplished, at least securing messages is accomplished through asymmetric cryptography. Yep. And so the question becomes, today, most systems create an account on behalf of a user.
Yes.
And the companies control how you authenticate. They control, whether you're alive or dead in the system, so to speak, right? And the idea of decentralized identity is, what if the user controlled that piece?
This is the conversation I had with Paul Simmons for a long time.
Yes.
So we had that discussion about that, and this got me thinking. After that conversation, I think it was going back maybe about 5-6 years ago. We were actually here at RSA, and I remember having the conversation over dinner, or we were with drinks at a party. And I was talking about the Estonian system, and he was talking about decentralized, of course, with the Jericho forum and everything. And he got me realizing that at that time, I started thinking about if we do decentralized identity and the user is the best person at bringing who they are, then it becomes that important part of the root of trust of how do we have mutual trust to, as I'm first time getting introduced, there's a way for me to show that we have a mutual party that can verify that I'm really
Right.
who I am. And then that started me thinking about, at that time, it was about 2016, about bring your own identity. And you get into that story about, and this is this conversation myself and Martin had recently, just an updated version of my thoughts in this, that you get into, well, if the user brings their own identity, that means you really, all the organization does is need to provide enablement and access and give them the permissions they need to. So is this something, is that where decentralized identity is going, that scenario, or are we still a bit early in the phase?
Oh, I think that's exactly where it's going. I would say we're mid-phase, in that we now have the standards are mostly baked now to be able to send credentials around. So I guess this is the other piece. Is part of decentralized identity is something called verifiable credentials.
Yes.
And verifiable credentials are, very similar to something like a SAML assertion. It is an assertion. It's a signed document. But the difference about a verifiable credential and something like a single sign-on assertion is that the verifiable credential is meant to be held by the subject of the credential. Yes. And so credentials, just like a regular wallet, credential gets issued to you and then you control it. You control when, as the end user, you control when you present that assertion. And so that three-party model of they call it holder, subject, and issuer, or holder, verifier, and issuer, changes the game. Because what it can do is it can allow you to suddenly present a credential that no longer is about establishing who you are, but what you can do.
Yeah. And this gets into even the question. So I remember later, after having that discussion with Paul, myself and Ian had a discussion. So Ian Glazer, we were talking about the same thing. And I was like curious to what his thoughts was. And it was into where you don't need even the data anymore. You just need to have the right question to ask.
Right.
So are you old enough to drive? Yes. And that's the only answer you need. And you need to verify that this is valid data. Are you able to stay in a hotel? Are you able to drink? Are you able to vote? You need to have the right questions. You don't necessarily need to look at someone's ID to get those questions. You need to have a source of asking those questions.
Right. And you have to trust who the person making the statement.
Yes, or have a mutual trust that actually can say that this data is correct.
Right. And in the case of when you think about foundational documents like driver's license, native digital driver's licenses are a thing and they're coming. Yep. And of course it matters. It really matters who says you can drive.
Absolutely. you want to make sure that it's coming from a very trustable source.
That's right. That's exactly right. As soon as the lawyers get involved, that's, as soon as somebody's going to sue someone else, then it really matters. And you have to be able to prove it.
Yep. So is this where, I remember even recently where we've now got many different identity providers now in Estonia. We used to be like one or two. And now we've got tons of identity providers. And depending on what level you come in, you've got different levels of security assurance level, depending on kind of how trustworthy they are. And now it's moved into where all of this is now moving into a digital wallet. So do you think the digital wallet's now going to be the kind of central place of data, let's say like a data proxy or a data exchange? Is that where?
Yes.
And it's becoming transactional as well, because when you look at current digital wallets, they're very static. But I think it's really important that they do move to a more transactional model and they stay updated.
Yes. And I mean, the amount of opportunity that a digital wallet represents is unbelievable, because what it can actually be is your trusted assistant. It can be the entity that's looking across all of your credentials and saying, if you pass this credential, you're going to create a correlation risk, right? Or if or you have already given this other credential to your website, are you sure you want to do that, right? Because now, because you're in the center as the user, all of a sudden you can check across all of the websites you go to. You actually have, you yourself can correlate your own data. Right? As much as you don't want anyone else to be correlating data, to have you be able to correlate it is incredibly powerful. And there's a couple of really interesting things. There's a thing called consent receipts. I don't know if you've ever heard of this.
I've got, there's a process in Estonia which was in the loyalty cards. So where you can determine, one is basically when you go through the payments and loyalty cards, you can determine, is it personal or is it tax deductible and so forth. So you can starting to do consent into determining whether I want to pass this already to the tax authority as you purchase the item.
Nice. Well, so consent receipts is very similar. Imagine a case, and it doesn't, the standard exists today, but there are very few implementations. But the potential is that every time, for example, you agree to a privacy policy at a website, they send you a receipt of what you agreed to and when, right? So that if they violate it, you can go back and say, this is what I agreed to.
It's almost the contract that's there. Because right now, all of those are very vague and not very clear to what you've done in the past. There's no proper audit trail or transactional model. So I think that's when I'm thinking about the digital wallet implementation and going into the transactional piece, you can actually have all of those consents maintained and verified and make sure they're actually being held accountable.
Right. And you could, in the future, negotiate them.
Yep.
I mean, you could literally say...
You could monetize them.
I'm sure you could. But that interaction's just never been possible before because you've always been a captive member of every site you're at. And they all think of it differently. They store it differently. And all of a sudden, there's this one central thing that can make it
So
better.
I've got my mind starting to get excited because I'm starting to think about how identity in the privacy side. And then, because I always think that, that convergence, there's a bit of that privacy is starting to become more of a digital rights management scenario as well. So, how you monetize it, because other companies are monetizing it on without your consent.
Right.
And now it's important to have that visibility and start maybe, it becomes also, extension of your income as well. Right. So what's next? What do you think is going to be what's the big thing for the audiences as a takeaway that you're going to see that's going to be the next big thing that's coming forward?
There's so many big things. Well, I actually do think that passwordless, going back to passwordless, is going to be, is big change, and will fundamentally change. And part of that is, if you haven't seen the Apple WWDC presentation on passkey.
I haven't seen the presentation. I've read some of the summaries. So, because I still think, the password experience, what it is doing is that fundamental secret, and you get into temporary secrets and temporary keys. And I had a recent episode with Dustin Hayward, Evilmog, who's the password cracking at X-Force Red Team. And we had the conversation that was exactly that scenario where you really, you're putting it all in the background. It becomes always the still challenge is the provisioning piece and how you migrate devices is always going to be kind of the risks.
Account recovery is.
Yes.
But this is the sort of the real significance of the Apple announcement. Passkey is a slight different implementation from your standard FIDO security key or Windows Hello type of implementation, where they are actually allowing the private key to roam.
Okay.
So it's a big deal, right?
It is a big deal, because that becomes a risk. That if it becomes and then you get into, well, what's the root? What's the parent? Where was it created? Are we going to create a chain of trust? Are they going to be derivatives of that private key, or is it going to be just duplication of the same key in multiple places? That gets a bit scary for me.
Yes, I know. And all of us are like, On the other hand, right, we have password managers today, which have taken us, a huge step forward in security. And, our passwords are stored in a password manager that is synced to our consumer world. And so this is basically the same idea, the idea that, your iOS passkey, right? That key would be available on any device that you own, right? And so now you can lose your device and not lose access.
So because it's going back to the same discussion I had with the Estonian government, because we had the issue back in 2015 where the weakness in the encryption, and ultimately it meant that it was about 800 and something thousand cards.
Right.
And there was the discussion at that time because your ID card in Estonia was the parent, and your SIM card or eSIM or the card in your phone was a child. You would actually use your parent to sign that. And they get into the discussion because of that issue about actually, well, let's make this one also equivalent. Let's duplicate it.
Right.
And I got into, I was like, are we sure we want to go that path? Because it creates a management challenge.
Yes.
It's, also the security concerns, but it does create a management nightmare about what is, where is that pyramid anymore? Because now we're moving into a rectangle, and now we have multiple of those.
Yes.
So
Yes. And it's a very different calculation for enterprise than for consumer, right? But the consumer problem is a huge problem.
Yes.
And, the question is, if we don't do something, if we keep these keys heavily bound to hardware for consumer use,
Yes.
then are we just creating technology that no one's ever going to adopt, right? So, the
I
thing
think so.
about
It's that's the challenge. We want to make it usable. We want to make people be able to easily pick up another device and just continue where they left off.
right, and if we can actually move people away from passwords, I mean that's the trade-off.
Yes.
If we can get 100% penetration, because we literally make it easier for someone to pick up their smartphone, use their biometric and gain access to any website on the web, then we have moved the ball in a very meaningful way.
Yep.
And then we can always tune what happens after that. We can tighten it.
Yep.
We can address fraud.
So this means that everyone's going to have a password manager.
It's going to be, yeah.
If you want to securely sync that across multiple devices, you're going to have the way to securely transfer it.
Right. And right now it's just the cloud platforms are going to take care of it. But that doesn't mean it's a very, I think once people really see the potential to have every single person out there be able to use passkeys instead of passwords, then who knows what will happen. But it's really important to note that the high assurance use cases are not going away. So the standard is not changing. It's not loosening, right? It's enveloping this secondary use case, but you can still drive your credential down to hardware if you choose to. And device-bound keys are still part of the specification.
Which has been the whole evolution in eSIMs and being able to kind of have multiple, devices that people have and to be able to use any one as the same thing. So
right, exactly.
So this has been fantastic. I could go on I literally could go on for hours on this topic. So for the audience, I mean, I think for a lot of our listeners, this is going to be so exciting to really get to better understand identity, the history about you and kind of your ideas. And I think the future is, for me, I love these types of conversations because it's just me kind of like, I've got my ideas going. So again, many thanks for joining the show and the episode. This is going to be so much fun. The audience is going to learn a lot about identity and where it came from and where it's going. So any final comments or words that you would like to share with the audience?
No, only turn on an MFA. But I suspect anyone who's listening to your podcast already knows that. So.
They know it, but I'm hoping that they have done it. There's no way of me knowing that they put it in place.
That's
but
right.
Definitely multi-factor authentication. Don't let passwords be the only thing that's keeping you safe.
Yes. And, if you can't turn it on for everyone, protect your admins.
Yeah.
Step one, protect your admins.
Absolutely. So again, many thanks everyone for joining us. Pamela Dingle, who is an awesome identity knowledge that we've had in the show. So stay safe. Tune in every 2 weeks for the 401 Access Denied podcast. I'm your host for the episode, Joe Carson. Again, many thanks for joining us and stay safe and have fun. Take care. Bye.